Okay, so I thought I would remind us all for the second part, why am I talking about this? Why is information access important to communities? Why am I interested in how the geography of information is playing out? Because I think it's fundamental to economic and social reorganization and kind of a massive restructuring that's going on. So what I want to do is just sort of talk about that. Sort of, I'm going to talk about the economic base theory of economic development because I think it's useful and we can sort of play on that idea through some other economic development ideas. Am I going to give you a warning for this lecture? Well, again, I'm going through a bunch of theories of the new economy, which again, I think these theories are in development. So it's kind of an exciting time for economic theory, but I have my, all I can do with these theories is try to, okay, I understand the theory. Can I see any examples of it? And am I confident enough in it that I would actually make some investments? That's kind of what I think we need to do in sustainability. Like, does this seem like an important thing for a sustainable community? Because it's moving so quickly, we have to be able to go through these theories and try to think, is this something that I'm seeing? Is this something that I think is important over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years? So that's what I'm trying to achieve here. And one of the other questions that going through a new technology like this and reflecting on its implications for sustainability is that we have to keep equity in mind. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I raise it in relation to the North and to rural and remote communities, is because I'm thinking about economic participation overall, access to economic participation, access to services. So I'm thinking about it from an equity standpoint. So at the same time, we have to remember that resilience and sustainability, you need, so like somebody's got to be participating in the real economy in some kind of productivity. And as we sort of lose a sense of what, I mean, it's pretty hard to put your finger on exactly what productivity is in the information economy and how we want that to look. But we have to we have to figure out ways that communities can have an economic life, have some kind of relationship to the outside economy, unless we're willing to make a whole set of other changes. And kind of, we have models where people have no connection to the outside economy, but they don't support the populations that we have now. So that's what I mean. So in many communities across BC, we have relied on resource exports for our basic income. As we try to think about how to make resource industries more sustainable, I think one thing we have to recognize is that sustainable forestry and sustainable mining, they are higher cost per unit output. So while there are some marketing strategies that we could be taking advantage of, fundamentally that you would expect that you would get less income from a sustainable operation than from an unsustainable one, unless you're really able to capitalize on marketing that sustainability. I'm just I'm just trying to be real. It's pretty hard for a miner to say, well, my ore is sustainably produced. So what are the opportunities here for resource-based communities? So, like I said, I want to start out with some economic development theory. So economic base theory is for communities. How do you decide how to do your economic development? You might have already heard this theory. It's kind of a classic theory of economic development. The part of the fundamental theory is I kind of find sort of challenging to my own preferences, but nonetheless, that the base, the fundamental economy of the community is its exports, those things that bring income from the outside. And any part of the services in that community are like a multiplier effect of this income. So we know those things aren't always true in one of those central places. The service sector itself is going to be, it's going to be drawing economic activity from an entire region. So the service sector itself is part of the fundamental economics of a place. But traditionally in economic base theory, these kind of exports from the community are going to be things. They're going to be like lumber or ore or manufactured goods. If you can get an auto plant to come to your community, then you can capture what economic base value, which is basically you can sell your exports out of the community. So think Mackenzie here, if you like. So a mill, or Burns Lake, actually, a mill is going to be located in a place that minimizes the cost of transportation. There's a sort of a calculus, like, it's kind of costly the way logs come down the mountain on those logging trucks. There's a lot of unusable lumber in that. They're kind of heavy. Anyway, that kind of transportation of raw logs you're going to try to minimize that relative to the packaged, secure, longer distance, shorter time, either rail or semi-trailer truck. It's nicely packaged with finished lumber, right? So there's a sort of a locational thing to where a mill town might be located. So a mill town is just going to have location advantages, how it's located relative to the highway, as well as it's going to have a workforce that knows how to do things, and it's going to have a sort of a quality of the lumber that comes down the hills to that mill. Those are going to be the locational advantages. Now, of course, individual mills can and do, trade regionally. We mostly do cedar. I'm thinking of the South mills, right? But I'm just thinking that might make, when there's so much pine, maybe everybody does pine. But what's the quality of the environmental supply, and how does that relate you to the market, to your export? So some of the things that affect your viability as a mill are within the town, like your labor supply and the age of your labor supply, or at least within the region. And some of them are completely out of your control, like international agreements and disagreements and downward price pressure on commodity lumber, industrial restructuring. If there's a change in demand for lumber versus other building materials, if there's a hurricane and a sudden spike in demand for lumber and building materials, all of those things are pretty much out of control of your town. So they can certainly either make your mill hugely successful or lead to its closure, but they're not necessarily in your control as a community. So, but if the mill is successful and mill workers reduce downward pressure on labor, and if jobs still exist at the mill and it's not completely automated, then the mill is an export-based operation that can provide income to households that support services in the community. So that's classic economic-based theory. Less classic economic-based theory, tourism. It's an export. Why do we call it an export? Because the money comes from outside. We're exporting experiences. We're exporting Instagram selfies. and by if a town decides to take up tourism, or there's that relationship between whether or not people want to come there, but you have some kind of locational advantage or environmental advantage that allows you to take up tourism successfully, the dollars the tourists bring to town are from the outside, so they're your export income. You have a relative advantage or not against other destinations or places that people might go. And then in terms of that mill model, right? These hotels, motels, and restaurants that serve the tourists, they're like inside the mill. And the multiplier services, schools, hospitals, community services are outside the mill, the tourist mill. Of course, the problem with tourist mills is that jobs in the tourist sector are often seasonal, low-paying jobs. And they're, so far those workers haven't managed to put the kind of pressure on the industry to make higher paying jobs. So overall, the economic-based community development strategy is to invest where the community has a relative advantage, a competitive advantage over other places based on its location or its amenities or its workforce or something there. You gotta go for it. It's kind of a classic economics theory. So what do we remember? Oh, I was just going to say it's a bit of a comparison, it's a bit of a contrast. Let me go back one. Bit of a contrast between invest where the community has relative advantage and some of those general resiliency, sustainability systems where you try to diversify, you try to make things more modular, you try to make things more sustainable to shock. Those are strategies for resilience and sustainability, whereas this is a strategy for competitiveness. We know we have some economic restructuring in the industrial economy, like capital intensification, which means mills have to be bigger. Pulp mills have to be bigger or they shut down. De-jobbing, they have to be, it's seeming cheaper to have places that are automated than to have places that have people working at them. As soon as you start de-jobbing something, you can have a heck of a lot of economic activity in the mill, and if you don't have any jobs that coming out of it, you're not really going to have a community economic development. You're not going to produce the same kind of distribution of the income. Of course, there's globalization, which we already talked about, which are kind of related to capital intensification and de-jobbing. And so what we've seen across the resource economy, and there's plenty of, I didn't put a lot of resources about this, but we've seen fewer resource jobs, lower average incomes to households, and a disproportionate effect on smaller places or those that are remote from transportation sectors. So it's not, I know, CASLO, I always know the stats for CASLO. Ask me any stats about CASLO. CASLO is traditionally forestry-based economy, and forestry was something like 40% of the income of the community at one time. And now it is less than tourism. Something like 6% of the household incomes are forestry related in CASLO. Tourism is 10. What's interesting, speaking of strategies for traditionally resource-based communities, is that pensions and pension-related incomes are actually really high in Caslow. So when we start thinking about amenity migration, which will be a little bit down, you start to think about um, can we get some of that free money? So strategies for traditionally resource-based communities is that you can continue to compete for lower returns. You can continue to invest in that mill and automate and make sure that you're keeping, 10 really good paying jobs instead of, the 200 that you used to have. You can continue to lobby for, reduced environmental protections. I'm not talking, I don't mean this is a sustainable strategy. I mean, it's an economic development strategy. Or you can try to decommodify the particular resource industry that you're in. This hour has 22 minutes. Did a thing about artisanal firewood, which I still think is one of the funniest things ever. But you can decommodify resource-based economies, and people do, through sustainable certification. You can, get a little bump in value that way through, well, a little bit. Say you're a ranch, you can brand your beef, grass-fed beef, and sell it direct to restaurants. You can develop specialty wood products out of your mill that require that people aren't going to be able to get off any other truck from any other place. So, you do quality-based marketing, those kinds of things. That's the second strategy. And you can also diversify for resilience and see if you can enter the new economy. So what is this thing that we talk about? What's the new economy? Well, there's plenty of names for it. And I want to talk about three sort of, well, to me, new economy is anything that's kind of post-industrial, information intensive. It's all those descriptors of that. And then I think in terms of rural and small town, and I think creative economy and amenity economy are really important. In terms of First Nations, I think there's maybe a way of thinking about creative economy concepts in First Nations. So new economy theories have been popping up for a while. We have the post-industrial economy, which people start to call it that, probably in the late 1980s. So post-modern economy, post-industrial economy. So basically a shift away from that manufacturing production standardized thing type of economy to, how can we further standardize and commodify to reduce the prices of products? Two, a shift from that to decommodified things where we have uniqueness and we have brand segmentation and we figure out ways to increase the prices of products. I saw a thing called a side table for sale on Wayfair, and it was looked like about a regular length of unsplit firewood to me, but it had a little bit of finish on the outside, and it was called an end table, and they were selling it for $297. I'm like, well, that is a good idea. That's a way to decommodify your firewood. And then there's this emerging economy around, which is related to things like brand segmentation and decommodification and people getting more attached to things so they pay more money for them. And that's kind of the roots in some ways of the information economy, where it's why it's worthwhile to track us with big data and sort of tailor the production process and those kinds of things that we're going through now. And then there's also an intellectual property economy. Information and ways of consuming information is itself a product, and that serves the post-industrial economy. And in that way of looking at the information economy, the unit of productivity is not like a thing. It's not when I produce a widget. It's when I write a piece of code and own the copyright. Just trying to keep an eye on the time. I'm having too much fun with this. So there's more than one definition of what I would then call the creative economy. There was Richard Florida's book, something like Creative Places, was very popular for a while, but it was a sort of a locational theory about post-industrial laborers like hipsters who are in IT and engineering like to live in places that have cool stuff. So it was about how people would continue to locate in urban centers because they were cool. But the definition of creative economy that I want to use is the economy of the arts and the creative sector. So, for example, the United Nations Creative Economy Program says it's the sum of all the parts of the creative industries, including trade, labor, and production. So, writers, musicians, filmmaking, artists, the whole caboodle. There is an interesting piece around, I mean, I don't know how many of you are musicians, but if you look at how musicians are faring in the information economy, you know, not well. They need more. They're like the farmers of the information economy, musicians. So, what are the implications of new economy ideas, of information economy ideas, if you're not San Francisco or Silicon Valley? Well, one theory is that the need for those locational advantages in the information economy still exist. Like people in the industry need to talk to other people in the industry. They need to have those social relationships to get new jobs or gigs, to learn about new things that are going on. So even though transportation doesn't require it, they'll continue to have highly dense cities, and the rest of us are going to become increasingly economically irrelevant, and our incomes will fall. So one implication, if that's true, is that we should plant a garden or move. Another theory is that the need for networks in post-industrial economies will allow people to create and produce regional advantage. So this is what they're really good at doing in European regional networks. They create and identify regions, and they base a tourism and a production and an agricultural strategy on that. They usually organize them as cooperatives. Establish a regional cooperative network of producers of various things and create a regional brand. Now, I can totally imagine that strategy, that sort of European strategy being taken up by a pretty cohesive First Nation. So do we need to co-locate to have those information networks? I just asked that question. Can information workers and creative workers be productive outside of urban centers? What does this take, and how would we know? So my experience so far is that there are information economy nomads. These are people who do work in the information economy, and they don't live in major urban centers. And how do I know this? I have met them. I have the gray hair, so I'm like, hi there, how are you? What are you doing on your computer in our cafe? And how come I don't already know your name? So anyway, yes, I've met them because I track our local economy. Of course, I might be an information nomad. But in terms of how far is this theory developed, not so far. I am going to need to pause this recording. See if I can, let's see if I can do it. There's another thing that's relevant, I think, to northern and rural communities called amenity migration or amenity economy relative to this location question. And here it starts with the observation that from about late 90s to early 2000s, so people are starting to theorize it mid 2000s, that there's development growth, like people are buying houses in all kinds of places like Santa Fe, Coeur d'Alene, Canmore, and globally in those European places. They're just buying usually second homes there initially, because remember that's in the prehistory before everybody had fiber. So initially, amenity migrants was the name for people that would commute to a second home, often by private aircraft in the case of in the States. But increasingly, I think amenity migration refers to households that choose a place to live independently of their workplace. So it can be like a second home base, like commuter based, or it can be information tech based. And this is where these theories start to come together, which is nice. What are the amenities that people move to? In general, the qualities that people move towards can be like scenery, recreation, clean water of mountain towns, or they can be moving away from having to pay their share of services, away from having to, deal with people that aren't as well off as them. I think I like to call it white flight with actual planes. But it could also be, we want to move away from the city to avoid the pandemic. We want access to clean water. So there's various amenities that if you don't have to be in the city, you might want to be in a rural or remote area. So what do we need to know to understand the impact of all this chatter on sustainability? Well, we would need to know enough to use it. Now, it's with economic theories, it's not good to wait until there's a fully formed theory, because by that point, a lot of people will have made their decisions. So, I've given a score to how useful the theory is right now. And I really think that we need to think about how that information technology, information infrastructure is going to be affecting us for a sustainable future. We can see some trends, like the GHG of transportation is going to be reduced. Potentially, there's some things about really actually fiber infrastructure that are centralizing along a network. If you really want to be on the fiber, you kind of have to be on the fiber. It's kind of like rail in that way, but there are some countervailing trends to that. Maybe you can get enough information kind of spread over from the satellite stuff. So how is this new information economy how are people going to relate to central spaces, central places, and how is it going to reorder the regional economy? And we have to keep the access to information infrastructure in mind. And I put an article about this in the module, I believe. Rural Canada residents pay substantially more than urban residents. To me, the takeaways are, and why I think this is so important, information infrastructure is already vital for many community services like health and education. It may facilitate amenity location of new residents and with outside incomes, with that export-based money. So this could help build the economic base of a place, so help diversify rural economies. It may facilitate local rural creative economy activities that link people into growth sector. And what I want you to do in the module, have a look at the fiber technology backbones and the recent announcements of SpaceX. It's, to me, some of that fiber stuff is reminiscent of railway building, especially the way that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are getting in there and competing against each other for fundamental infrastructure. And communities do need the capacity to actually hook in, actually the network management capacity to participate. And so there's some interesting new resources around that. Okay, I thank you.